Hey guys, welcome back to the Whimsical Workshop. I want to show you our next project we're going to be working on. You may have already seen this quilt, and I designed this quilt as the free project to go with it. It is a free download pattern at henryglassfabrics.net is where you can find it. But it was also the cover girl for this month's keepsake quilting catalog, where you can actually buy a fabric kit if they still have any left when this airs. But I was so excited to see our free pattern on their cover that I'm going to go ahead and walk through doing this project. Welcome back. I finally have everything cut. It took me a couple of evenings of just chipping away at it, but I've got it all cut except for the panel. And the reason I haven't cut the panel yet is because tip number one to making this quilt is how to deal with panels. We deal with a ton of panels, design with them almost daily with the different fabric companies. And the one thing I can tell you about panels is that when we're designing with them, we're designing with the digital file, and we are not designing with the actual panel because it hasn't been printed yet. And so panels tend to come in, can come in either a little smaller or a little larger than the actual artwork size. So for that reason, we design all our panel quilt patterns with a floating border. And what I mean by a floating border is we're going to put a border on the panel and then trim the panel and the border to size. I get a ton of questions as to why do we not put the actual size border on the panel. Well, in a perfect world, we would know exactly what this panel is going to measure, and we could just do that and everything would be great. But a lot of the patterns we design, the panel is the center of the quilt. It's the focal point. And all the borders, if they're pieced, have to match the size. If the panel comes in smaller or larger, and I don't give us any room to fudge, you will be stuck with a quilt where the center, either you have to cut into the artwork on the panel, or you're going to have weird seams hanging out on the panel, weird color lines from where we can't trim it nicely, because we have to get to a fixed measurement. So that being said, all our panels have a border that is at least a ½ inch, sometimes an inch wider, depending on how complex the quilt is. And you put it on the panel, and then you're going to trim the panel with border to size. All right, so now we have our panel, and it measures out correct. So we're just going to set this aside for the moment, because the next step is to do the applique borders. Tip number 2 is how to do the applique borders. I have designed the quilt so that the borders, you can put all the flowers on each of the 4 borders and then sew them onto the quilt. That way, when you have to finish all the edges of your flowers, you can do them in a strip versus having to fight with the big, huge quilt. So here are our shapes. For this project, I'm using Hot Fix adhesive. This is a permanent fusible web, which means I wouldn't have to necessarily stitch around all my edges, but I'm going to because I think it looks nicer. I think it gives it a more finished look. This is a really great fusible web. I've used it mainly because I cut on my Cricut cutter. I didn't hand cut all of these guys. And it works beautifully on cutters, on AccuQuilt cutters. It's a really nice fusible. It is permanent, so you don't want to use it if you think you might be making a few little mistakes, because it is hard to pull it apart after. All right, to do our flowers, the first thing we need to do is make sure that these are cut to size. I have cut the width, so they are 6.5. I need 2 that measure 36.5 inches, and I need 2 that measure 37.5 inches. So when you have these really long strips to cut, what I do is I make sure the fold is aligned. 36.5 is 18.25. You can use a calculator if you need to. So I'm going to lay the 18.25 on my border, and I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to cut this. When you open them up, they are 36.5 inches long, and these are my side pieces. So I want to make sure, because there's only an inch difference between them, that you keep your side pieces separate from your top and bottom pieces. So there is the top and bottom, and 37.5 is 18.75. See how little there's a difference on those? So you want to make sure you keep them apart. Don't let them mingle. When I go to do this, if you can recall the quilts, there are all these flowers, and each flower is made up of 8 petals and 1 center. And then you have all your stems, they look the same. So what I like to do is before I even put the flower on my border, and I'm going to put my side borders over there so I know that they're playing nice, is I like to build them on an Appli-Fuse pressing sheet or an applique pressing sheet, depending on what you've got in your studio. So I've got my handy dandy one here. Here's another tip. I like to roll it up and clip it with 2 Wonder Clips to keep it from unrolling. And that's how I store my pressing sheet. Hopefully you're working on a bigger ironing board than I am, but I'm doing this under the camera, so I want to make sure you guys can see it. So the first thing we have to do is remove all of the paper on our petals. And I'm not going to make you guys watch while I do this, but here is my tip for scoring the back. There we go. You just scratch and peel. So what I like to do is I like to fan out a bunch of these like that, and I will just hold them and scrape across the back of a bunch of them, and then I can peel them off very quickly and very easily. So I'm going to get all of these ready, and then we'll be back to show you how to assemble the flowers. Now that we have all the paper peeled off of our shapes, I am on to tip number 3 for this project, which is use an applique pressing sheet and assemble your flowers on the sheet before moving them over to your border. So to do that, we're going to do like a clock. We're going to do 12 o'clock, 6 o'clock, 3 o'clock, and 9 o'clock. And we're going to take a center and make sure that we pull these out as much as we'd like them. Okay. Like that. That looks good. Then we just take these and fill in between those petals, whoops, without moving them. And again, flowers are organic, so they're going to not all look exactly the same. They may look all exactly the same on the picture, but that's because we did that in a computer and now we're human and we're doing it. So there's the first one. So the side borders are the 36.5-inch strips. So I'm just going to double check because there was an inch difference between the two to make sure I have the side borders and not the top and bottom. And I do. Alright, so as you can see, this is folded in half. And if you look at the picture for the side border, it goes from red flower to red flower. So in the center is a stem unit pointing down. And then we have the flower. So I'm going to be building this first. The other thing I'm going to do is fold the strip in half lengthwise and press the center line down the middle so that I also have that as a guide. So I'll have a center line in both directions, and that will help me position the flowers and the stems much easier. So that is tip number 4. Make sure to give yourself guidelines to press and position your applique onto your pieces. So the first thing I am doing, if you can see here, is I'm laying it all out so I can have an idea of where things are going to go before I iron anything down. There we go. And again, we're going to put the leaves on after. Okay, so now that we have the flowers and the stems down, now we're going to go back in and iron the leaves back in. It's just now I can really position them where they actually look cute on the quilt. But there you go. You see how quick and easy that was? So I'm going to go ahead and finish the other borders, and then I'm going to move on to tip number 5. Alright, so we have all our flowers and vines pressed onto our borders. And now tip number 5 is how to finish these. If you want it to stay soft and very much into this palette, I recommend matching your threads to the shapes. If you want it to be strong and bold, you can outline everything in a black or a charcoal gray. We want to keep it soft and matching the panel, so we're going to go ahead and match our threads. I'm going to go ahead and use 40 weight or a fill thread to do this. And I've picked colors that are a little bit darker than the actual shapes, and you can always see what it's going to look like by laying it on top of the fabric one thread at a time, and that will tell you how it's going to look. So like this looks really, really gold and dark, but when you lay it on there, it's very, very pretty. So you want to do a one thread test. Pick the right weight. If you are really new to this, I recommend going with a 50 weight and matching the threads as close as possible. That way, if there's any discrepancies in your stitching, you're never going to see it. Versus going with a 40 weight and going really dark and bold, where every little mistake will pop out on you. So again, just lay these on here like that. We've got our blue and our green and our red and our gold. The numbers are 2140 for gold, 2250 for red, 2884 for green, and 4140 for blue. So we have those 4 colors. Now another thing is, if you follow the pattern and you cut the petals as listed, there are most of the petals, I think most of them are 24 petals and some are 20 petals. If you were to just go ahead and cut all of them at 24 petals, you will end up with 2 extra flowers. Again, if you're not comfortable finishing your edges on this piece, you can take these 2 extra flowers, iron them on iron them on a scrap of fabric, and you have 2 practice pieces to warm up on before you stitch your flowers. Now to stitch these, I'm going to use a blanket stitch around the edges. I'm going to link a video below because we do this stitch a lot, and I've got some really good videos on showing you how to blanket stitch, and if you wanted to machine embroider some vines in here, that's in that video I'm linking below in the comments. And if you're not on a computer, you can certainly just watch some more of my videos. It's the A Present from Penny block that I'm going to reference. So that's tip number 5, is to pick the right threads for the job and make sure that you have a practice piece if you need it. And the bonus tip is to go slow, just slow and steady, and you will be so surprised. And if you do make, if you're stitching along and you do sort of jag out a little, I recommend not fixing that until the whole piece is stitched, and then go back and see if it's really going to bother you. Because a lot of times when you're looking at something like this, it looks like a huge mistake. But when you look at the whole picture, you can't even find the mistake. So do look at that. And then one more bonus tip is, if you do have to rip any blanket stitching or edging stitching out, rip it from the wrong side of the piece, not the right side. You would just take your seam ripper along the threads that would show up back here, break the threads, and then peel it away, clean away the threads. If you do it from this side, you will fray your edges. So those are all the tips for putting together the Gnome Is Where Your Garden Grows. I'm going to go ahead and get the top finished, and I'll show it to you at the end. And I might have another 1 or 2 bonus tips at that point. So I'll be back. Oh, one more bonus tip. See, I didn't even walk away. When you go to stitch these, it is really handy just to roll this up so you see just this flower, and you can maneuver it under your machine. And then as you stitch that one up, unroll and roll and unroll and roll. And then you're just still dealing with a much smaller piece than these really long tails. So that's one more tip for you. Now to go sew. Here is the quilt all finished with the flowers and borders added. Yep, I am up on a step stool trying to video this for you before we get it off to the quilter. If you want to see it finished and hanging beautifully when it's done, you can follow me over at Instagram at whimsicalworkshop.com. Again, this quilt is called Gnome Is Where Your Garden Grows. It is a free pattern over on henryglassfabrics.net. The collection was designed by Shelly Comisky. We love her sweet, sweet gnomes. And they're if they still have them, there were some fabric kits available for this over at Keepsake Quilting. So I hope you've enjoyed the video. I hope you've enjoyed the 5 tips on how to make this guy. And if you have, make sure you like and subscribe. Thanks for watching.